not messing around with your records. Somebody charger here, along with a comb? Why? Interesting, all right. Have not graded quiz 2 yet, but should soon, should be in the next day or two. So nothing really to say there. Questions, comments, or concerns? Don't let me forget next week to announce or to post, and maybe I'll do it today. 2 weeks from now is Daffodil Festival. For those of you that don't know, it's a thing unique to Newton campus that we do every year. And there are speakers and events and all kinds of stuff going on over a 2-day period. Typically, my responsibility is to bring in a keynote speaker. And so my main concern is that speaker is not speaking to an empty auditorium over there. And so I'm going to give you like 20 points extra credit if you're able to attend the keynote, and then 10 points if you go to any other event in the festival. So there are other talks and events that you can do. So I will make that announcement formally, sometime between, or sometime this week, I guess, on Tuesday.
What time is the keynote?
I believe it is. Let me just see.
I just want to make sure it didn't somehow wind up during one of the 2 classes I have.
In that case, now last year this was a total disaster. It was not necessarily anybody's fault, but they attempted to have these available live streaming and recorded. Hopefully it goes way better this year, so if you do have a conflict, that you can watch the recording later and just kind of write me up a short summary, and you can get credit for it anyway. What's interesting is this coincides with one of our colleagues in the history department who was at Dunwoody campus and who tragically died several years ago, Mario Benniken. We have a symposium named in his honor on various aspects of Black history. He also taught what was called back then African American Studies. Our keynote here is simultaneously part of the Benniken Symposium, our daffodil keynote, so it's kind of fills both of those roles. Is the reason why I'm looking it up here. Why do they not have the schedule? Oh, they do. Okay. So for us, the keynote is Tuesday. This is not next week, but the week after. I think, no, maybe it is next week. I'm sorry. Yeah, so a week from today, the 21st at 10 a.m. And if you can't get there, it's over there, or you have a conflict, you can register for the virtual presentation.
One at 10 and one at 1?
Well, that's, this is all Benniken, so let me see if, I think I have it in my Dropbox, hang on. I will say too, if you can't make it to Dr. Black's talk, you can. What I'm going to do is just cap it at 30. So you can go to Dr. Black's talk and pick out any one other thing that's part of Daffodil, and you get your 30 points. Or if you can't go to Dr. Black's talk and you don't want to watch the recording, you could just do any three other events for 10, 10, 10. And it's all across the day, Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Yes, sir. Will.
I'll be working the event. I don't know if I'll be able to participate in anything in particular.
So everything should be recorded. So everything should be available after the fact for you to watch all of the talks anyway. Obviously some of the stuff that's hands-on you won't be able to do, but any of the talks will be recorded, so you should be able to, after the fact, when you've got some time, watch them and just...
To get the 20 points, what about the 10 points with 10 different events? Will those be recorded as well?
Yes. So in theory, now in theory, they should all be recorded. We'll see. And if it turns out there's a total disaster or problem with that, we'll figure out something else. Let me see if I can remember my Dropbox password. Yes, sir.
So are you going to be there? So if I go in person, I don't have to write anything?
They'll have sign-in sheets for everybody with a place to say, I'm here for Dr. Bagley, Professor Fletcher, whoever. Okay. Some, maybe both. There may be other professors that are offering extra points to be over there. So all right. I know some that are requiring theirs to go over there. I'm not doing that, but anyway. Yes. Just look at it. Oh, that's really useful. Okay, how about we just download it then? everything painfully slow today. Not even that big of a file. Control and use a scroll. Okay. So 10, that's the keynote, part of the Bennigan Symposium, that's Dr. Black. 11:30, there is a round table you can go to also over there in the auditorium. 1 o'clock, so you can see there's continuously stuff going on in the auditorium. There's another panel concerning the GSU Prison Education Project that we have. And you can see there's some hands-on stuff like building birdhouses apparently. The 3D STEM lab, you know about that, Mr. Phillips. And even in the evening, there is a community chat book discussion at 6 o'clock over there also in the auditorium. You can go do yoga with Professor Langston. And let's see, Wednesday.
Where's that flyer at?
Everywhere.
I'm going to post it in our iColony site. So I've made a note to myself on my hand here, so you should, I'll try to do it right after this. And that should be available for y'all in iCollege, because I don't think it's been sent out to you in digital form as such yet, so I will make it available for you. That was much quicker, that's nice. So again, yoga in the morning, yoga in the afternoon. Professor Canada facilitating a college to career thing over there in the auditorium with a guy who works for a studio around here. So if you're interested in film work or film industry work. After that, there is a poetry and prose in the Pines, which as you can see, I have been strong-armed into playing and singing a song in a past life. I did play music for about 25 years, semi-professionally, so they are, every year this happens, they can't get anybody to go do any poetry among students, and so they end up saying, oh, Anita, Joe, why don't y'all do something? That will be, hopefully that'll be outside if the weather's nice, but last year we had to do it in the H room over there, which is weird because it's very boomy in there.
I'm just curious, what kind of music did you do?
All different kinds, man. Over the years, I was in like a jazz funk band. I was in a country band. I was in a hard rock band. It's just me and an acoustic guitar. It's more like singer-songwriter stuff, like Ryan Adams, James Taylor, John Mayer.
All right.
It's been varied over the years. Another hands-on thing, daffodil painting. One of your fellow students, Elizabeth Matthews, won the Daffodil Scholarship. Obviously, the heart of this, if you don't know, there's a field where daffodils bloom every year right out here or right out there. And one of our long time faculty does a walk out there to visit the daffodils every year. And that's at 1:30. Again, 3D STEM lab. Into yoga. And then, speaking of your fellow students, if y'all know Cody Harbin or Jason Barker, they are screening a film that they have made at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, and that will count as well. And that's being sponsored by Trio. Some of y'all know about Trio. Questions? Okay. Well, you want to learn about llamas and alpacas in the Inca Empire?
Why not?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, all right. Why not? That being said, where are we? We're on Reconstruction, yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the broken promise of Reconstruction. Oh, I hate when that happens. Why? So you can either adjust that, which you can't do because I don't have the remote, or you can adjust this, which would have me up here looking like an ass because this thing is terrible and difficult to manipulate.
Well, I guess I'll have to seek a refund for my tuition.
Because I can never get it to go up, you know what I mean? It's supposed to just kind of... See, See, this is great. I mean,
The projector's pretty strong, so like we can still see it when it's projected on the black part.
yeah, I may just leave it. You know, that's fine. That's it. You know.
It works like blinds, just do it to the side.
Oh, is that what you think?
Maybe.
I mean, feel free to give it a try if you want to have a go.
I'm good.
Exactly. I think I've reached my limit. I'll just confirm that I have no ability to adjust the projector. So yeah, you guys can see it, kind of, sort of. Well, it says the broken promise of Reconstruction, what we're going to talk about. Reconstruction means, in a very simple way, reconstructing the Union. That is, bringing back into the United States those states that had seceded and had joined the Confederacy. They have now been defeated in the Civil War, and there has to be some kind of process to get them to rejoin the Union and to put America, so to speak, back together again. Now, eventually that will lead us to like actual citizenship rights for people who have been slaves and people of color more broadly. It will lead us to the first, as you can see here, black members of the United States Congress. But by 1900, it will lead us to this. And that is the emblem of the Democratic Party of the state of Alabama, but could have been for any southern state, all the way up through the 1960s. It says white supremacy for the right. By around 1900 or so, black people had been completely disenfranchised and segregation had been installed all throughout the South. So how do we first get from the end of the war to this, and then how do we get from this to this, illustrating how this was a broken promise? Jack?
This was just in the mention of for the rights, where the terms left wing and right wing come from. Those come from different forms of the Estates General, mostly in France, where on the left would be the third estate, and on the right would be most of the other two.
I actually did not know that. I know about the Estates General, but I did not realize that's where our labels for our political spectrum came from. That's interesting.
Most right-wing ideologies would support the traditional power of
Right.
the nobles and the clergy, and thus were associated with the right half of the estates.
Versus the more populist third estate or left wing. Very cool.
Yeah, that's where those terms come from.
Interesting. Learn something new every day, even old Professor Bags.
You can learn from Dr. Rodwell.
Wow, that's true. He knows his shit for sure. So what does Reconstruction mean? We just kind of laid that out. Reconstructing the American Union, putting the United States back together again after secession and war. But there are questions that remain. Because we don't have in our Constitution a blueprint for how to deal with this. There's nothing in our Constitution that says if you fight a bloody, fratricidal civil war that kills 600,000 people, here's how you put the nation back together again. And so, again, there are questions as to who gets to decide what this looks like. Is it the president? Is it Congress? Does the Supreme Court have some say in that? Who is in charge is question number one. And beyond that, what all will it involve? And it could be anything from, do we punish the leaders of what the president always said was a rebellion? Do you execute those people? Do you throw them in prison?
There's also the bigger question of every single person who fought in the Confederacy was guilty of treason. Do you arrest and possibly execute half the country? What is an appropriate reaction to that?
Right, exactly. And at the same time, what do you do vis-a-vis these states? I mean, those governments of those states have to be dismantled. When they're built back up, are you going to make them pay like reparations for the war? Would it be like complete opposite of that and be much more lenient and be a much more streamlined process? Within that second question of what all is it going to include was also who gets to participate.
There was also the literal method of Reconstruction because it's a war, in order to disrupt supply lines, you had to destroy tons of infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it was actually a lot of literal construction in case of the people who were benevolent towards the South.
Right, so part and parcel of the second question, the what, is it will almost assuredly have to involve reconstructing, literally, as you say, the South's infrastructure that had been destroyed during the war. And so who gets to do that? Who benefits from that? Who can participate in the process? Meaning, like you said, if technically all these people, anybody who was elected to a state or federal office in the Confederacy, anybody who voted yes for secession, anybody who was served in the Confederate Army that was not necessarily drafted but was a volunteer or was a commissioned officer, all those people are technically guilty of treason. But what are you going to do? Imprison, like you say, hundreds of thousands of people? But the other question is, can those people then participate in forming new state governments and just say, sorry about all that, our bad, we're cool now? How are you going to approach that in terms of ex-Confederate? Do they get to participate in the process or not?
Did they instead target the aristocracy that built up the ideology?
That would be one option, right? Jefferson Davis, who's been president, Alexander Stephens, vice president, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. Do you imprison or execute just those people? Do you perhaps bar only those people from participation? These are all questions that are up in the air. Answer to the first question, who is in charge, is answered during the war by Lincoln. So Lincoln, before he is killed and before the war is over, initiates the process of Reconstruction with himself in charge. So there will be a period of time that we call presidential Reconstruction. It will continue under Lincoln's vice president, as we will see, for a short time, until the authority is seized by Congress, and we will later have a period of congressional Reconstruction. So there's kind of two halves here, and we're here in the first half. Lincoln initiates this process with an executive order. Remember, like the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order aimed at helping win the war. Here is an executive order aimed at initiating the process of Reconstruction in areas that had been seized by or were controlled by the Union Army already before the war was over. It's known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. There's a word in there that should tell you the general characteristic of his approach. What does amnesty mean?
Protect and forgiveness.
Like a legal forgiveness. So his approach here is, in a word, forgiveness for most people. It's not going to involve executing high Confederate officials, not really even going to involve throwing anybody in jail. And it would involve, of course, dismantling any vestiges of the Confederate government or the Confederate state governments and replacing them with new state governments. Now, to participate in this process under this proclamation, all you had to do was take an oath to the Constitution and to the United States and say, I am now loyal, once again, to the Constitution of the United States of America. So it would wash away whatever sins you had in supporting the Confederacy if you now took this oath. And once a certain number of people, it's something like 10% of those who had voted in the last legitimate federal election, once you got to that number, you could begin to form a new state government, draft a new state constitution, and to petition Congress to be re-entered into the Union.
Is that the 10% thing?
That was it. So presidential Reconstruction under Lincoln, you could write it down in a word, is extraordinarily lenient to the South. Lincoln's argument was, there's been enough bloodshed and suffering, let's just do this as quickly and efficiently as possible.
What was the number for the amount of people?
10% of those who had voted in the last legitimate federal election.
Okay, thank you.
Now, there were those within Lincoln's own Republican Party who thought that this ought to be a lot more radical process. That this was way too lenient, and that it had a number of serious flaws. these people become known as the radical Republicans. Their chief concerns were that, number one, you ought to have in place of that oath of, yeah, I'm now loyal again, forget all of what I did before supporting the Confederacy. They wanted what became known as an ironclad oath. Ironclads were the ships of the day of the Civil War. They were wooden still, but they were covered in iron to protect them from cannon shot. It's a metaphor for a much stronger oath, the language of which is, I have always been loyal to the Constitution and to the United States of America. And in order to truthfully and legally take and sign such an oath, it would have to mean that you did not support the Confederacy. It would mean that you never voted for secession. It would mean that you did not willingly join the Confederate Army. It would mean you were not elected to the Confederate federal government or to a Confederate state government. In other words, it would bar all ex-Confederates from participating in forming new state governments that would then petition the Congress to return to the Union. And I think it also called for a much higher percentage, like 50% of those on the voter rolls, to take this ironclad oath to be able to move forward.
A big thing is that during this period in which a lot of ex-Confederates were either unable to participate in democracy or were slowly gaining back that right, this was a very small portion of history where in the South a lot of former slaves actually came to power very quickly.
That was the second part of the radical Republicans' criticism of the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. There's absolutely nothing in there about the citizenship rights of those who had been slaves, or for black people in general. And by the end of the war, as you know, it becomes a war of emancipation, and there's a proposed 13th Amendment that's going to end slavery. But then the question is, what is the status of those who have been slaves, considering things like the Dred Scott decision that said if you're black, you're not an American citizen? The radical Republicans wanted a guarantee for black citizenship rights. And the Wade Davis bill would have done that. Radical Republicans in Lincoln's own party proposed to essentially override Lincoln's executive order with a bill that provided for an ironclad oath, a ban on ex-Confederates, and for protections against, or for protections for the citizenship rights of black people, including former slaves. Question?
Oh, you just knew I had a question. Okay. What's the title of this?
Oh, just Reconstruction 1863 to 65.
No, like the whole.
Oh, the whole lecture? Just in the I-College?
Yeah.
Just Reconstruction, I think, or maybe the broken promise of Reconstruction.
It's the broken promise of Reconstruction.
Sorry.
I actually got it now.
Okay.
You found it?
Yeah, I just want to catch up.
Okay, no worries. So, what about this Wade Davis bill? Well, it passes Congress, and Lincoln vetoed it. And at that time, and I will stress at that time, there were not enough radical thinking people or radical Republicans in Congress to have a 2/3 majority to override Lincoln's veto. So he wins. And here we have this supposed great emancipator whose views, as you know, are nuanced and changing, who vetoes a bill that would ban ex-Confederates and would provide citizenship rights protections for former slaves.
So, like, the radical Republicans, like, opposition to him is the Wade Davis bill?
Yeah, so it's members of his own party that think what he's doing with this proclamation, this 10% I'm now loyal oath plan, is way too lenient. So members of his own party criticizing this, saying, you shouldn't just allow all these former Confederate officials to, not only have slap on the wrist, but they can just participate in forming new governments and just say sorry about all that. And also his plan included no guarantees for citizenship rights for former slaves. So it's members of his own party trying to check him and go above and around him But he gets to avoid that because they don't have the numbers to make it law without his signature. So he's able to veto their bill. Does that make sense? This would include, obviously, Congressman Wade and Davis, but also people like Charles Sumner, who got beat down but survived. So there are plenty of members of Lincoln's own party that think he's going way too easy on the South.
If the running Republicans are like a party that opposes Lincoln, how do they gain a majority in Congress eventually to oppose vetoes?
Great question. And the answer is Lincoln has a lot of pull and power, and of course, what happens to him, though? And Andrew Johnson becomes president.
And that's when they gain majority.
Because Johnson, I would just say Johnson is regularly regarded by polled historians as one of the 2 or 3 worst American presidents of all time. He lacks the virtues necessary and the skills necessary to be an effective leader, especially of a party that is divided like this. Lincoln can manage it, Johnson cannot.
Part of the results of all of this desire to punish the South that I think Lincoln was trying to avoid is that the planter class did not just dominate the South through economics, it was also propaganda.
Yeah.
They made everyone stand to believe that their racism, their authority over things was what kept the South together, and this led to them being able to shift a lot of that propaganda to be more overtly like in favor of both segregation and against the North. Basically, look what they're doing to us.
Yeah.
You have to let us back in power so we can fix it, so we can fight them.
Yeah, that's what eventually is going to be the counter argument. Once we do begin to see actual black participation in politics, we're going to get to the 14th to 15th Amendment. That's how we'll sort of counter that eventually and reverse everything. Now, one final word here. Now, Lincoln did at least create a Freedmen's Bureau to work under the Department of the Army, to work with the Union Army in the South, which, by the way, when the war is over, the Union Army occupies the South. It is split into military districts. Once you eliminate those Confederate states from existence, the South is divided up into military districts with military governors as this process of Reconstruction plays out. And there is then a Freedmen's Bureau which would work with the Army and work with people in the South to the freedmen's was the word, by the way, for former slaves. Men, women, children, whoever. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency that would help reunite them with family and community. Obviously, the war led to a lot of displacement, especially the millions of slaves who at any point ran away to get behind Union Army lines of protection of the Union Army.
You know, that movie, Emancipation, that just came out by Will Smith is a perfect example of everything you're talking about right now.
Yeah. I have not seen it yet. I plan to. You've seen it?
Yeah.
It's good?
It's good. And it's in black and white.
Oh, nice.
Like it's actual that time.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you said that. I'd forgotten. I'd seen the trailer for that at some point. I'd forgotten
It
about
is. It talks about, you know, him going for Lincoln. It actually plays with Lincoln's speech and everything.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
It's good.
I also should have mentioned, didn't they do a film several years ago about Harriet Tubman? They called Moses, who was part of the Underground Railroad for
Yeah.
helping these people
It
escape.
wasn't
Wasn't that great? All right, well, I'll watch the Will Smith one first. So the Freedmen's Bureau would help reunite former slaves with family and community. They would provide in the immediate aftermath of the war, like medical care, food, clothing, to people who were essentially refugees at that time. But in the more long term, they worked with folks in setting up the first schools for black people in the South. And that would include, like I talked about at Hampton, like the first HBCUs, but also just grade schools. I mean, during slavery times, there were no schools for black people because slaves were not supposed to learn to read and write. And so it goes a long way in growing literacy among former slaves in the South. And also, too, probably most importantly, the reality here, as we will see, when there's no redistribution of the land and agriculture remains the main occupation, a lot of former slaves are going to continue to live on land owned by white people who might be their former master, but per the terms of the 13th Amendment, they should be getting paid wages now. The Freedmen's Bureau was there with the backing and power of the Army to try to make sure that that was actually happening.
Wasn't that called sharecropping?
This is going to lead eventually to sharecropping and tenant farming, yes. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, what about when Lincoln is killed, Andrew Johnson becomes president? Don't try not to confuse Johnson with Jackson. It could be easy to do. They're both Andrew. Their last name starts with a J. Same number of letters, ends in son. Both from Tennessee. Both have been slave owners. And so you might pause here and say, wait a minute. This guy is a former slave owner from Tennessee, and he's Lincoln's vice president? How or why is that possible? A couple of things. One, he was not Lincoln's original vice president. Lincoln chose to have him on the ticket for his re-election in 1864, which it was not a given. I think some of us talked about this, that Lincoln would be elected in 64, but Sherman wins, takes Atlanta, tide of the war is turned, and he does get re-elected, and Johnson becomes vice president. Why would Lincoln do this? Number one, because Johnson was a loyalist. Johnson was a guy who could take the ironclad oath and say, I didn't vote for secession, I didn't support the Confederacy, I sold my slaves and left the South, I have always been loyal to the United States. The thinking being, at that point, you're pretty sure you're going to win the war, you're going to have to put America back together again, send a signal to loyalists in the South that, hey, we can come together again as one. And obviously, at no point was Lincoln thinking, well, what happens if I'm killed and this guy becomes president in the immediate aftermath of the war? But this is what happens. Now, his plan is more or less Lincoln's plan. He continues under the terms of the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, continues with the 10% take the I am now loyal oath and forget about what you did in the past, amnesty or forgiveness for supporting the Confederacy. The only difference is by this point, Congress has passed the 13th Amendment. And so now to get back into the Union, once you have people take that oath, form or write new state constitutions for Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, whatever, you had to acknowledge that slavery was no longer constitutional. And that you could not continue practicing slavery. That's really the only difference. Now, I talked about land redistribution, or mentioned it just a moment ago. What does that mean? There were times towards the end of the war where Union generals who thought about stuff like this, including Sherman, realized that the South is going to be defeated here, but you've got hundreds of thousands of slaves who are going to technically be freed, but all the land is still owned by white people, and really a small group of them. What's really going to change if that remains the scenario? So while I'm here, says fill in the blank Union general, including Sherman, with my army, let me take land from these treasonous Confederates and parcel it out into 40 acres. Start to worry that he's going to start firing members of his cabinet who are radical. And so they pass a law that says basically, the president has to consult Congress to approve members joining the cabinet. We feel like the president should consult Congress in order to fire or remove a member of the cabinet, like the Secretary of War or Secretary of Treasury or State or whatever it is. And then he goes and does that anyway. And they say, well, you violated this law. We can now bring articles of impeachment against you. But remember, that doesn't necessarily mean you're removed from office. And basically what Johnson then does is cut a deal. he agrees to back off of Reconstruction policy and let the radicals have it, to let Congress take control of Reconstruction, even if that meant undoing everything that had been done under presidential Reconstruction in order to not be removed from office. And so he essentially becomes a lame duck, as we would say, president. Somebody who doesn't really have much power or authority, even though they're still in office. And so now we have entered the period of congressional Reconstruction. And we have, first, a military Reconstruction Act. I like to describe this as the reset button. It basically it wipes out all of the new state governments that had been formed in states like Georgia under the 10% I'm now loyal oath program. Anything that had transpired in terms of Reconstruction under the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction was wiped out, which meant you had to once again divide the South into military occupied zones, hence the Military Reconstruction Act. So we've started over. And the radicals are now in charge. So we have a supplemental Reconstruction Act, which provides for an ironclad oath type program. A ban on most ex-Confederates from participating in drafting new state constitutions, of being delegates to constitutional conventions, and of running for and holding office in these new state governments or in Congress. So the Supplemental Reconstruction Act is now essentially a ban on ex-Confederates. Only loyalists could participate. Now, just in case some of those loyalists were like Johnson and also wanted to write black codes into their new state constitutions, Congress passes a Civil Rights Act. Excuse me. Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 says that you cannot single out a group of American citizens. And note, by the way, former slaves are now citizens. You cannot single out a group of individuals, say black people, and tell them the law applies differently to them. Any law. So it provides for the legal concept of equal protection. Everyone has the equal protection of the laws. In other words, every law applies equally to every American citizen. This would invalidate any and all black codes. Because those black codes, just like we were talking about, they're not even trying to hide it. They're just saying, hey, by the way, if you're black, you can't do X, Y, Z. Your labor contracts are different and have to include X, Y, Z. Those would violate the idea of the concept of equal protection and would be invalidated. And then finally, there's the Enforcement Act, or the Force Act, which essentially allows the military to treat groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and especially the Klan, as enemy combatants, and to go after them, and to engage them, and to jail them for their violence and intimidation. Now, I will say at that time, there was some question about some of this, especially the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Some said, in our federal system, does Congress really have the authority to point its finger at the states and say you can or can't make laws that are like this or do this or that? And so what they did is write that into a constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment includes an equal protection clause that says the law applies the same to everyone. You can't single out a group of people, say by skin color. And explicitly in the 14th Amendment is talking about former slaves. You can't do that, single those people out and say the law applies differently to you. There are things that you can't do that other citizens can do.
They didn't even explain why.
Huh?
They didn't even explain why. They just said, no, you cannot do it.
Right, exactly. Well, if they were to do that again, that's now invalidated by the 14th Amendment, in theory. The 14th Amendment has another clause, but it has actually two more. One, it says we all enjoy the same privileges and immunities of federal citizenship. Another way of saying you can't just single out people by characteristics like skin color and say, you don't have the same rights. But also it says, no state government can deprive any American citizen of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of the law. Now, where have we heard something similar?
The Fifth Amendment.
Fifth Amendment, right? Remember how they twisted it? People like Calhoun and then the Supreme Court to say that applies to slave property and slaves or whatever.
Oh, yeah, the song.
Right? So, but if we've heard it before and it's already in there in the Fifth Amendment, why put it in here in the 14th? What's different?
They're not property, they're citizens now, so you have
Two things. One, with the 13th Amendment, slaves are no longer property. That argument no longer applies. And this 14th Amendment is directed specifically at former slaves.
Yeah.
That's number one, but there's one other thing that's different. It's one word. Uh-oh. Will thought you had it, and I said one word, and you're like, I punt.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't know the word, I know
Is
what I
it
think it is.
So the language of the Fifth Amendment is the federal government can't deprive an American citizen of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law.
Is it?
14th Amendment says no state government can deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. In other words, the 14th Amendment applies the Fifth Amendment to state governments.
Because the Bill
Oh,
of
and
Rights is only-
they couldn't do that at first.
Right? It wouldn't have applied to the state of Georgia. It wouldn't have applied to the state of Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana or South Carolina. Now it does. In this way, in constitutional law, moving forward, and this is not a con law class, but just to put it out there, because I think you were about to allude to it, this is eventually used by courts to apply other parts of the Bill of Rights to the states. Because that's not the language of the Bill of Rights. It's all about what the federal government can and can't do. So this is eventually used to say, the state can't deprive you of your right to bear arms. The state can't deprive you of your freedom of speech, or the state can't establish a religion. State can't, take away the freedom of the press, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? What about 15? 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights to black men. And I stress there the word men, because immediately the argument is made by the women's suffrage movement that this ought to apply to women, black or white, and the Supreme Court says no. In a major decision rendered not long after this was enacted, and obviously then the women's suffrage movement has to continue to fight for the right of women, black, white, or brown, to be able to vote well into the 20th century. But the 15th Amendment was designed to guarantee to black men the right to vote. It was thought to be so important that it needed an amendment of its own apart from the 14th. So while the Union Army is in the South still, while the Enforcement Act is in play, this leads to black people voting in the South for the first time, getting elected to state governments, even in places like South Carolina and Louisiana, and a majority in those state governments, and to sending to the United States Congress the first representatives and senator of color ever to serve in the U.S. Congress. So what went wrong? Question first.
You said the Supplemental Reconstruction Act had a ban on what?
Ex-Confederates. So anybody that you could prove had voted for secession, anybody who had served in, let's say, the state legislature of Georgia during the Confederacy, anybody who had voluntarily signed up for the Confederate Army, anybody who'd taken a commission as an officer, anybody, the Confederacy also had a Congress of their own. So if you had been sent from the state of Georgia to the Confederate Congress and served, you're banned. because you could not take that oath of I've always been loyal. Some white Southerners would come to call the redemption of the South, and that word redemption carries a religious connotation, but what it means is to redeem something or to get back what was lost, to get back something of the old South as it was before the war, that to get back something of the antebellum South, that means the South before the war. How does this come to be? Well, first of all, as we get into the late 1860s, we get into the 1870s, certainly we get into the 1880s and 90s, within the Republican Party, you start to see new priorities. Things that had been put on hold by the war are now on the table again. Things like Transcontinental Railroad. Things like subduing by warfare Native Americans and settling things like the Kansas and Nebraska territory, where, by the way, precious metals like gold and silver are discovered. So settling the West, going back to war with Native Americans. Industrialization will be the topic of our next lecture. So focusing on industrial growth in America and the rise of new corporations and all kinds of new technologies that will be applied to industrial production. The rise of big business, which the Republican Party will champion. All of these things. Foreign policy, America becoming an imperialist power, and eventually, for example, going to war with Spain and capturing some of its colonies in other parts of the world. Establishing colonies in places where you subdue Native Americans in areas like Hawaii, for example. So these are all new priorities, and the upshot is that people grow weary of having to keep a constant eye on the South. And they begin to focus on other things. And everywhere, the Union Army couldn't stay in the South forever either. And so everywhere that you see the Union Army is removed, slowly but surely, you get the return of activities of the Klan and other terrorist groups, who at that time were attempting to prevent, through violence and intimidation, black people from voting because they know they're going to vote Republican. And in this way, they're functioning, groups like the Klan are functioning like the sort of like paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, which is going to come to stand on a platform of white supremacy. And then we have the Compromise of 1877. There was a presidential election that year, and there ends up being some disputed electoral returns from, I believe, the House had a judgment call to make, and the way they voted was going to determine who was going to become president. And the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, whose name rings a bell because he becomes president, basically cuts a deal with Southerners, including some Southern Democrats, and saying, look, support me, and when I become president, I will pull all remaining troops out of the South. And Hayes wins the election, all remaining Union troops are gone, and that's the end, essentially, of Reconstruction.
Another thing throughout this is, like, you've got the lost cause myth on the slide there, and you mentioned it a couple times, but this was primarily propagated by an organization called the Daughters of the Confederacy,
Yeah.
who basically were the ones who helped spread it the most. They were responsible for the vast majority of Confederate monuments throughout the 1960s, where they were first put up. And
Some of them in the early 1900s.
they initially were taking advantage of a sentiment at the time, which sounds kind of ridiculous, that women could not have political opinions.
Yeah.
That they were physically incapable of doing that, so any action a woman took was obviously apolitical. So
Yeah.
it's fine.
Yes, that's all part of the lost cause history, as you mentioned. And it begins with essentially this Compromise of 1877 and the dismantling of the governments, the state governments that were formed under Congressional Reconstruction. By 1900, in every single state in the South, by the early 1900s, I should say, every one of those states held a constitutional convention and replace their state constitution from congressional Reconstruction with now new ones. So you had the states as they were before. You had Confederate states. They had under presidential Reconstruction, they had reformed, and that was reset by Congress. You had new state constitutions then. Now those are going to be wiped out with brand new state constitutions. Now let me say this, and I will ask this on the test. Gone are the days where you could do black codes, because now you have that 14th Amendment. So you can't just say anymore, black people can't do X, Y, Z. That legally would fail in a court of law. So what do? You enact Jim Crow laws, which do what? Segregation of all public accommodations. Meaning,
They said if you can't beat it, just go
yeah.
around it.
Which, I mean, obviously are also, I mean, constituted a 14th Amendment violation, but hold that thought for a second. Saying that, you know, black people can't be in the same car on the railroad, on the train, different separate cars. Or street cars that were coming into being using electrical power in cities from Philadelphia to Atlanta to San Francisco to move people about the cities. Restaurants, hotels, schools, public schools, movie theaters, parks, libraries, all of these constitute what we would call public accommodations. And these states are saying, you know, black and white people have separate. Now, of course, someone named Homer Plessy did get on the streetcar, the whites-only streetcar, and take a case to court and argue, isn't this actually a violation of equal protection? And the Supreme Court in Plessy's case, in Plessy versus Ferguson, says, well, you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. The doctrine of separate but equal, which completely ignores the obvious fact to everyone that the point of the separation or segregation was to be a constant reminder of a second-class citizenship.
I mean, it really wasn't equal, but it was. I mean,
And the facilities also never really were equal, and that's the entire point, because the purpose of segregation was to uphold an order of white supremacy. Now, what about the right to vote? Now, you can't, like, say anymore, you just can't vote because you're black. That would violate the 15th and 14th Amendments. So what can you do?
Grandfather clauses and poll tax.
So poll tax. The poll is the polling places where you go to vote. If you have to pay a tax in order to do that, and most black people in the South had recently been slaves, or their parents had been, they probably don't have a lot of money. Well, let's say that some of them have worked really hard and do have the money to pay a poll tax. Well, what about if they, you know, only set about to do that like 3 or 4 or 5 years after the thing went into action? Well, it accumulates every year. So if it went into effect in 1895 and you didn't go to register to vote until 1905, you don't owe just 1 year of poll tax, you owe 10 years of poll tax. And now we're talking about something that's a real impediment. Yeah. Now, also, as you pointed out, or we talked about earlier, if you were formerly enslaved, or the children or grandchildren of the enslaved, maybe you'd been able to obtain an education at one of these new schools, but a lot of you had not. So another way to pass a law that doesn't say black or white, but is still designed to prevent black people from voting, would be a literacy test. To be administered by a local white registrar that would make you do anything from signing your name or to all the way to, say, read and interpret a section of the Constitution. Now, you pointed out something else that I didn't speak to. There are a lot of illiterate, poor white people in the South, too. But you wanted them to vote. So what could you do to make sure, without using words like black, white, race, that this would affect, these poll taxes and literacy tests would only affect black people?
Because you can, first of all, they're not going to vote in the same place at all. So it's going to be segregated. So you can have literacy tests going over there, but not really over
Yeah, the literacy test, for one, could be discriminatorily administered, meaning you could make the white person sign their name and the black person read the Constitution.
Yeah.
But there's something else you could do that would apply to either the literacy test or a poll tax, and that's the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says, hey, if your grandfather was a registered voter,
Are you?
you're exempt from these new qualification requirements.
That's every white man.
The significance of this, without using words like black or white, is that if you were white, there's a really good chance your grandfather was a registered voter. And if you're black, there's pretty much zero chance because your grandfather was a slave, right? So these are quote-unquote colorblind ways of making laws that apply in a way that would limit the rights of black people so you could get around the 14th and 15th Amendment. And we can talk later about prison contract labor and chain gangs and all that kind of thing in terms of the 13th Amendment as well. Finally, so by the way, this word, disenfranchisement. The franchise is like the suffrage, it means the right to vote. So if you enfranchise someone by, like, say, passing the 15th Amendment, that's enfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is taking that right away through things like, in this case, poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause. And of course, ongoing violence and intimidation as well. And then through organizations like you mentioned, Daughters of the Confederacy, through people like Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, writing lengthy books about this.
Also, I know I should let you finish explaining what the lost book is first. Sorry, Peter.
That's all right. So you set about essentially retelling the story. You essentially take the history and reframe it. And it starts with the idea that the war had nothing to do with slavery, that it was an actual war of northern aggression, a war of economic sanction, if you will, against the South, and that you had been outmanned and outgunned in the Civil War, and so even though you fought valiantly, it was a lost cause. And it continues from there, but go ahead.
This comes from the original justification outside the planter class, which ties to their propaganda, that black people were monstrous and violent and could not form societies, and thus the only way for them to exist was in subservience. And if you let them go, you would get Haiti, and thousands of white people died.
Yeah.
Note, the thousands of white people did not actually die in Haiti. Most of them got spared because Pacific slaves were like, hey, this person is remotely nice, let's let them go.
Right.
But as soon as the Civil War ended, all of them realized that was objectively untrue, and so they had to justify this not just to the North, but to themselves and their children.
Yeah.
Why they did this to these people.
Very well said. Yeah, all that is, I would agree 100%. That's kind of becomes the new point of departure, would be, I think, another way to say it is, of course, steeped in biological racism. And yeah, that's the framing of it. And then you get the idea that, once the Confederacy is defeated, you have this way of life, the antebellum world before the war, where everything was great. What Jack was just saying, you're preventing this, slaughter, massacre, because you got a system of slavery, which, by the way, they said was better for everyone, including the slaves. They were all very happy. They labored very happily for the white planter class. They were well taken care of and healthy and so on. And regrettably, after the war, that was all gone with the wind. Right? And what happened after that, they described as Black Reconstruction, where you put ignorant people and carpetbaggers and scalawags in charge of government, and there was no regard for law and order. And law and order broke down. But then the Ku Klux Klan came along to restore law and order.
They had to take it in their own hands.
And when law and order were restored, there was no need for the Klan anymore, and we began to redeem what we had lost in terms of what we could of that old society. If this sounds far-fetched, and I know I'm at time here, when I was doing research for my dissertation became my book, I interviewed an attorney who worked on a lot of school desegregation cases in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And he said, man, once we finally got some black kids into formerly all-white schools, and this would be in the 70s, he said, man, we found some crazy stuff in some of these textbooks. And he said, I want you to see if you can find this. There was a textbook we found for fourth graders, and it was not uncommon, but this was in Alabama. And he remembered portions of it verbatim, including kind of what I was just saying. It was something like, when Law and Order broke down, a group of white hooded riders came on the scene and were able to restore law and order by going to bad, lawless people and holding court in the forest at night. This is a fourth grade history textbook sanctioned by the state, and I did find it, and he remembered it exactly right. And that book began that chapter by saying, imagine you live on the plantation and you ride around with your father who's the master, and all the slaves are happy. And you go with your mom to the slave quarters, and she's their best friend, and they know it. And then this terrible war happens, and it's all destroyed. But thankfully, the Klan was around to restore law and order. And that was in the 1970s. I mean, my brother could have been in a
Founders
school.
of the Ku Klux Klan are on Stone Mountain. They're right there.
Yeah, the second iteration of the Klan was formed there. That is the fact. Okay, well, anyway, that's the Lost Cause history. We'll talk about industrialization next time.